What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video. Today we're going over the Warden tank. Warden tanks are pretty much exactly where they have been between Harrowstorm and Greymoor. There were no real new sets that were introduced that sort of supplanted older sets, and there weren't really any sort of class balance changes, so our skills aren't really going to be shifting too much here. So whatever build you guys had for Harrowstorm should work perfectly well in Greymoor. You shouldn't need to make any sort of major changes to your toolkit as a Warden tank. Now, Warden tanks are still quite popular in the endgame community, making up one of the more commonly seen PvE tanks in endgame content. And that's partially because Wardens do provide a bunch of group buffs, which are a little bit more difficult to find sometimes. Plus, Warden tanks in general, generally speaking, tend to have tools in their skill sets that kind of lend themselves a little bit more towards tanking. So Warden tanks are definitely pretty strong. They're a little bit more difficult to learn how to play than Dragon Knights or some other classes, but they're definitely very rewarding if you're able to master them. So, just like the rest of our build videos, we will not be going over any sort of gear in this video. That is reserved for the tanking gear video, which should be popping up in the upper right hand corner right about now. So if you're interested in knowing what sort of gear you should be running, check out that video. This video will be focusing in on our skills as well as our but generally speaking, how to play a tank in ESO and how Warden tanks differ from other classes. Let's go ahead and get started here first with our front bar here. Now, Wardens do have a native source of minor protection, so you don't necessarily need to run Ransack. You can run Pierce Armor instead. However, it's up to you whether you want to run Ransack or not, just because your native source of minor protection might not always be up because it is just relying on a different skill. Ransack, on the other hand, will always be up because you will always have your taunt up, so it's going to be a little bit more consistent that way. So it's up to you which morph you want to run. Pierce Armor is going to be good if you're in a situation where you don't have a healer, for example, in format content where you're running 3 DPS, 1 healer, 3 DPS, 1 tank, I should say. But typically speaking, a healer will be providing major breach through Elemental Drain, so you don't necessarily have to run Pierce Armor if you don't want to. Next, we have Heroic Slash for the Minor Maim and Minor Heroism. Minor Heroism to give us a little bit more ultimate so we can get our Warhorn up faster, and Minor Maim to reduce the damage that the boss is dealing both to you and to everybody else around you if they have some sort of AoE attack. Polar Wind is going to be our self-heal. Actually, not that bad. It's received a couple of buffs over the past few patches here. Now, the initial burst heal is actually pretty decent. It's just shy of about 30% of our max health, plus you get some additional healing done as well. So in total, you actually get a fairly strong amount of healing, anywhere between, I believe it's about 40 to 45% of our health or I should say probably close to 40% of our health is healed up with the heal over time combined with the burst heal that we're getting from Polar Wind. This does scale with our max health, so it's always going to be a percentage of our healing done. It also heals one other person for that same amount of burst healing that we get, so the higher your max health is, the higher that burst heal is going to be for that one ally. You're not really going to be using it for that heal on the ally, but it is something nice to consider. Then we have 2 flex spots. So we have Shimmering Shield here as our first flex spot, which helps out with projectile-based enemies. So it generates basically 3 shields, and you can absorb up to this amount of damage from 3 different projectiles. And every time you absorb a projectile, you get some magicka back, but the big part is you get Major Heroism, which gives you 3 ultimate every 1.5 seconds. So that averages out to 2 ultimate every second, which is a really, really powerful ultimate generation tool, so you can get your Warhorns up even faster against bosses that use projectiles. It's very useful in places like Black Rose Prison. That basically allows you to pump out Warhorns like it's candy on Halloween, essentially. Then for our next flex spot, we have Deceptive Predator for the Major Expedition buff. You also gain Minor Evasion while it's slotted, which reduces damage you take from AoE attacks by 10%, which is useful for overall damage mitigation as well, because there is a fair amount of damage you will be taking that counts as AoE damage. And for our ultimate, a few options here. We're sticking with Reviving Barrier here for the 10% initial Magicka regen that you can get from the Magicka 8 passive under the support line. Now for our back bar, this is going to be where we're going to be running our Lightning Staff, Ice Staff, or Bow. We have Inner Rage as our ranged taunt. We have Balance for the Magicka Sustain. We have Ice Fortress. This is going to be the source of our minor protection as well as our major resolve. You don't necessarily have to run this here because we're already getting major resolve from running Balance, which we're also getting a Magicka Sustain from. Plus, so if you're running Ransack, then you don't really need to run Ice Fortress at all. Now, the benefit of running Ice Fortress is that it does hit everybody within 8 meters of you, so it also grants that major resolve to anybody close by. So that can be useful for overall DPS survivability if you don't have a Warden healer running Expansive Frostcloak. So this is a flex spot if you run Ransack, basically. Then we have Blockade of Storms to help proc our enchant. For Ice Staff, it's going to be Blockade of Ice. And then for a bow, we're running Endless Hail. Then we have Energy Orb, which we're going to need in order to basically proc any set that we have that relies on healing other people. You can obviously use Polar Wind, but that's only a single burst heal versus Energy Orb, which heals everybody around you. So Energy Orb, generally speaking, is going to be more useful for proccing sets like Symphony of Blades. Plus, it also provides the Healing Combustion synergy, which restores Magicka and Stamina whenever anybody activates the synergy. Then we have our main ultimate of choice, which is going to be Aggressive Warhorn, which we're going to be using for the Major Force buff. Now, in terms of other abilities you might want to have on hand here, Bold Netch, if you need the additional Stamina Sustain, it also is a self-purge, so every 5 seconds you get to remove 1 negative effect from you. It is a random negative effect, unfortunately, you can't choose. But this is mainly for the additional Stamina Sustain that you'd be getting from having the Bold Netch out. Now, you can obviously Stamina Sustain by using heavy attacks, but the passive sustain that you get from Bold Netch could be beneficial as well. Under the green balance line, Living Trellis or Leeching Vines are both potentially useful skills. If you look at your feet, it basically always hits you. You can basically treat this as essentially damage mitigation because it heals you for every time you take damage. So you get 1.3k heal every time you take damage. So you can basically ignore 1.3k damage, essentially, is what it boils down to. Unless, of course, it kills you, in which case you die because the healing is done after the damage has taken place here. Leeching Vines, typically speaking, is going to be the morph that I recommend running because it does apply minor lifesteal, which helps heal other allies, and it also procs any sort of set effect that you have that requires you to heal other people. Under the Winter's Embrace line, you have Gripping Shards as a hard CC. This is centered on you, so you will need to be mindful of where you are. You need to be within the trash fight in order to throw this out there. Does deal a little bit of damage well, does scale off of our max health, and can also apply the shield status effect, which applies minor maim. So there's another way to get AoE minor maim. Already talked about Polar Wind, already talked about Shimmering Shield, already talked about Ice Fortress. Next one's going to be Frozen Device, which is essentially the Warden's versions of Chains. It's a little bit clunky to use, so it definitely does require some getting used to. Basically summon out an Ancient Portal, which arms after 1.5 seconds, and if the enemy is able to be chained in, it'll be teleported once it steps into the portal, and also hard CC'd for 3 seconds. It also deals damage, and they are afflicted with Major Maim, which reduces their damage done by 30%. Now, if the target is not teleported or cannot be teleported, then the portal does not activate, and you do not get that mobilization, you don't get the frost damage, you don't get the Major Maim. So it is only useful for chaining things in, essentially. You can have up to 3 of them out at a time, so unlike with chains where you have to basically target the enemy, you can just basically throw this out there and hope that an enemy happens to stand on it. So if you know the spawn locations of certain enemies, if you know where you want them, where you know where they're going to end up being, you can throw these out preemptively and just chain things in. Now, if they happen to be further than the 28-meter range, then they will not get teleported over, but they will eat up your portal. So just be a little bit mindful of where you are in relation to the portal when you lay it down. Going over our one-hand and shield line, you have defensive posture. Both morphs, Absorb Missile and defensive stance, have their own uses. Absorb Missile is pretty good if you need additional self-heal. So, for example, in Cloud Rest, if you're the portal tank, that can help you out there if you're having trouble sustaining your health. Defensive Stance is useful if you want to do some just raw damage. So, for example, in Lakestes, if you're the main tank, one strategy involves using Defensive Stance to reflect the Frostbolt back at Lakestes so you're able to deal damage. I would recommend picking up Shield Charge as a gap closer. You will need this if you're running Halls of Fabrication at all. Shielded Assault is going to be the morph that is best suited for tanking. Under the bow line, if you're running the bow back bar, Endless Hail is going to be how you proc your enchant, and I would also recommend taking a look at Venom Arrow as a ranged interrupt. For the Destro Staff, it is going to be the Crushing Shock morph of Force Shock for that ranged interrupt, and Elemental Blockade is going to be how you proc your enchants. And I would also recommend taking a look at Elemental Drain as well. Usually a healer will be running this, but in 4-man content where you're running 3 DPS, 1 tank, you might need to run Elemental Drain instead because obviously you don't have a healer to do it for you. Under the armor line, Unstoppable, both morphs have their uses. Immovable is going to be, generally speaking, the more useful one just because it does increase the amount of damage you're able to block when you activate it. It does provide you with Major Resolve, which you should again be getting from Balance. Both morphs grant you immunity to knockback and disabling effects for 6 seconds, but it also reduces your movement speed by a very hefty amount. So if you decide to use the ability for that immunity or the block cost, the only way you're going to be able to move reliably is by dodge rolling. So just be mindful of that. Using Immovable or Unstoppable Brute can result in a very large stamina drain if you're not careful with how you use it. Under the guild line, you have Ring of Preservation under the Fighter's Guild line, which can be useful as an AoE heal as well as providing minor protection to the group. You do need to be stacked fairly closely. It only has a 5-meter range, so just be mindful of that. Beyond that, under the Citric Order line, you have Meditate. Both Morphs, Introspection, and Deep Thoughts can be useful for Magicka and Stamina Sustain. Now, this is a channeled ability, so you will not be able to cast any of the abilities while you are in the channel, and you obviously can't block while you're in the channel. That'll just take you straight out of the channel animation. The good thing is, though, that Citric Order does have the Deliberation passive, so you do get the major protection while you're channeling it, but obviously it's not going to give you as much mitigation as just a blocking will. Just be mindful of when you decide to use Meditate to make sure you're not getting caught getting hit by a very large heavy attack, for example. Make sure to have everything unlocked under the Undaunted line. You have Overflowing Altar for the minor lifesteal and the Blood Feast synergy, Shadow Silk for the Black Widow synergy, obviously Inner Rage for your ranged taunt, Bone Surge for the Spinal Surge synergy. So the Spinal Surge synergy and the Shadow Silk synergy, they're basically mostly used to help Lakessi's uptime. Shadow Silk, the Black Widow synergy, still does a decent amount of damage even though it has been nerfed. And then Spinal Surge, the shield is not that great. The Major Vitality can be useful in certain scenarios, like in Cloud Rest where you need additional healing done. But generally speaking, it's just going to be used to help with Lakessi's uptime essentially. I know you talked about Energy Orb. Finally, under the Alliance War line, you have Echoing Vigor as another way to heal allies around you, as well as a self-heal. It's not going to be as strong as something like Polar Wind, but it's still an option if you need to heal other people. And then under the support line, if you need to purge multiple effects or you need to purge other people, you should be running Efficient Purge instead of Bull Netch, just because it purges more effects and it purges multiple people. And that pretty much covers it for all the skills that you're going to want to have on hand as a tank. Now, in terms of tanking in ESO, for those of you guys who are coming over from other MMOs, tanks, generally speaking, do obviously need to taunt things, and you are obviously going to be the damage sponge, but you also have a secondary function that some tanks that come from other MMOs aren't really aware of, and that's basically to help buff overall group DPS. You can do that by providing buffs to the group and debuffing your enemies. So a lot of your buffs and debuffs are going to be coming from set bonuses. So for example, Yolnahkriin provides the minor courage buff, and Alkosh reduces spell and physical resistance on any enemies that you happen to hit with the effect. So both of these help improve overall group damage. In addition, you also have other skills that you can run that also improve group damage. And one that kind of people don't really think about is something like Major Heroism from Shimmering Shield. You basically get faster Warhorn uptimes, which gives you higher Major Force uptime, which increases overall group DPS. You have things like Ice Fortress, which can grant the DPS Major Resolve, which improves your survivability, which in turn basically allows them to survive potentially hits that would normally be one-shots, and basically gives them a little bit more leeway and allows them to play a little bit more aggressively as a result. You have Energy Orb, which provides the Combustion synergy, which restores stamina or Magicka back to help your DPS fully sustain their rotation. So basically, being able to manage your buff and debuffs so that they're pretty much always at max uptime is kind of the hallmark of a really great tank in ESO. Obviously, your first job is to be a tank, it is to taunt things, it is to be a damage sponge, but once you get used to the mechanics of the fight, once you know the fight flow, what you can avoid, what sort of damage you can anticipate taking in, and how to heal yourself through it, that's when you want to start focusing in on debuffs and buffs. The hallmark of a great tank, again, is trying to get as high of an uptime as you possibly can on those buffs and debuffs that you're able to provide. Now, Warden tanks, they have this really nice sort of balance between tankiness as well as group utility as well. So they kind of fall very similarly to where Dragon Knights lie, in that they have tools in their toolkits for every single little piece that you might want a tank to do, but not necessarily excelling in any of them. So for example, their burst heal is not as strong as Green Dragon Blood, but it's still pretty decent. They have plenty of buffs to help them with Ultimate Generation, to help with Warhorn uptime like Shimmering Shield, but they can also provide group buffs as well, like Major Resolve through the use of Ice Fortress as well. So with all of that, Warden tanks fall into this sort of master of none, this jack of all trades, master of none, where DK tanks also fall. So Warden tanks, much like DK tanks, are pretty easy for beginners to pick up. They are slightly more challenging with how you want to hard CC things, just because portals are a little bit clunky to use. You have gripping shards as well, which is centered on yourself, so not too different from the DKs, but it's definitely a little bit trickier to play Warden tanks just because of how Frozen Device ends up working out with laying down your portals and having to time things versus Unrelenting Grip, which is an immediate pull. So a little bit steeper learning curve compared to DKs, but still relatively easy for a beginner to pick up, and also very rewarding for an expert to master as well. Now, I do have a couple of videos where I have tanked as a Warden on my stream's archive channel, but I do recommend checking out other content creators that do tank hard mode PvE content, like Nephis, who I do know has several videos of Warden tanking on his channel. So I highly recommend checking out other content creators like Nephis, but you can always also peruse my stream's archives to look for those few videos that I have as a Warden tank. That pretty much concludes this build video. If you guys have any questions at all, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them all to the best of my ability. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.